Some see a city. We see a 300 square mile residence, currently shared by over 8.5 million people who have made it their own. From kings and trailblazers to explorers and visionaries. Generations of the most influential families and some of the most colorful characters. Engaging eyewitnesses, eye-opening discoveries, and even some animals. After centuries of remodeling, we can't imagine living anywhere else. It's more than a city. To us, it's home. Welcome home. We're glad you're here.
We thought it was a good time to talk with some of the artists who we have worked with.
It wasn't so much the mask that really got to me, it was the eyes, because you see that primal fear in people.
We kind of question the fundamental information that are asked on the senses.
It was almost like a ritual that you get up in the morning and you get to the park by 10 o'clock, 9:30, and you don't leave until sunset, sundown.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Fran Rosenfeld, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Museum of the City of New York. Welcome to this evening's program, Our Fair City Work. And this is the second session in our series, Our Fair City, Building a More Equitable New York, moderated by Justin Davidson and co-presented with Curbed. Throughout these conversations, Justin will explore how we might rethink and rebuild our city's built environment from the skyline to the street with a really impressive group of New Yorkers and experts. Tonight, for the conversation about work, we're honored to be joined by developer and landlord David Ehrenberg, community leader Esmeralda Herrera, and architect Claire Weiss to discuss how we can think New York's work and business districts. Justin will introduce them in full in just a minute. And perhaps you were at our first event last month, which looked at issues of rethinking how housing and home is designed. And our third event in the series will be next month on Wednesday, January 27th. Justin's going to talk about all the public spaces in between home and work. And he'll be joined on that in that program by urban designer Justin Garrett Moore, transportation expert Shin-Pei Tsai, and landscape architect Kate Orff. So please join us for that third session on Wednesday, January 27th. You can find out more and sign up at mcny.org/ourfaircity. I'll welcome our speakers to the screen in just a moment. But before we get started, I just wanted to thank all of you who may have contributed to the museum over the past 9 months. And as we approach a very different holiday season, I hope you'll remember the museum as part of your year-end giving plan. Memberships, contributions, even just sharing your love of programs like this really help us play a vital role in ensuring we can continue doing what what it is our mission to do, which is to be New York's premier storyteller. Please note, we're going to be taking questions throughout the program via Zoom's question function. And so you can submit a question to Justin and he'll try and take it if he can fit it in. We're not going to be using the hand raising function or the chat function. If you're watching on Zoom, please note that closed captioning is available for tonight's program, and you can enable that at the bottom of your screen. So now I'm going to introduce our moderator, Justin Davidson, who will in turn introduce our three distinguished guests. Justin, as many of you know, has been the classical music and architecture critic at New York Magazine since 2007. He's now the editor of Cityscape as part of Curbed, New York Magazine. He won a Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2002 and an American Society of Newspaper Editors Criticism Award. He's contributed to The New Yorker, W, Travel and Leisure, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and Salon, and has appeared on WNYC and NPR. And he is author of the wonderful book, Magnetic City, A Walking Companion to New York. So now, Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. The impetus for this series came out of an article that I wrote back in October, looking at the very particular moment we're in the middle of a pandemic, but also, with a fiscal crisis upon us, a burgeoning sense of the role that social justice plays in our political and economic landscape, and also a year out pretty much from a municipal election, which is going to give us a new mayor, 2/3 of the city council, and several other top jobs in the city. And it seemed to me that this was a moment, building on the experiences that we've had during the pandemic, where the mechanisms of New York and the procedures and the objects that make it up, everything that we've become accustomed to understanding as the way New York works, was really both under pressure and also presented us with, to some extent, a sense of opportunity, but more importantly, a sense of obligation, that this was a moment where really so much about New York can change and is likely to change, And the way I thought of it was that it's going to change everything from home to work and everything in between. So we decided to set up these conversations as in a 3-part series: home, work, and in between. So we're in the middle of that now. And we've invited 3 passionate New Yorkers, people who are contributing every day to the life of the city, and to talk about what work means in a city and how it might change from 3 very different perspectives. So guys, I'll ask you to turn your cameras on. Now, as I introduce you, we're going to lead off with Claire Weiss, who is the founder and principal of the architecture firm WXY, which has been one of the most public, civic-minded architecture firms in the city. There's no corner of the city that she hasn't, that Claire hasn't thought about, in many cases intervened and master planned and designed, simply to make it work better and to make the city more humane. David Ehrenberg is the CEO of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, one of the really success stories of adapting the industrial waterfront for post-industrial New York. And we're going to talk about what that means, and also the persistence of manufacturing in the city as a constant thread. And Esmeralda Herrera from the Bronx-based group Communitas America, and she will tell you about the center that they are developing and building in the South Bronx called Hayground as a meeting place for entrepreneurs. So I have lots of questions, but I'm going to ask you to get started with some very brief introductions to the work that you do, and then we'll pull it all together, starting please with Claire.
Thank you, Justin. I'm going to use my 4 minutes or less to, in a sense, represent kind of any architect, or many architects could equally pull things out of their portfolios before and during, and we hope eventually after what we're going through now with COVID. You know, the city is fundamentally, its buildings are still there, but work really is continuous. So that's right there is the workplace we were at. Look, here we are in a block of Chinatown where WXY was. Next slide. And this was work we were doing, you know, starting 2 years ago with the city of New York, imagining the Sunset Park Industrial District. What are the new, how does one combine traditional, basically warehouse and distribution and manufacturing, you know, the core 4, from everything from traditional to new kinds of manufacturing. And this Sunset Park was a district that really did not necessarily have the investments and the kinds of things David Ehrenberg is doing at the Navy Yard, but the city was starting to recognize that industry, keeping industry in New York and keeping workplaces were important. So keep going. Here we are, next slide. Notice that transportation, in terms of work, getting to work, leaving work, was also kind of starting post-Sandy. The ferry system was giving people a kind of new take on that commute to work. So that's something I think it's important to think about, which is the mobility issues relative to work. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of not only the work of architects, but the work of the city and building itself and the issues of crisis. This is work, the reconstruction of the Rockaway Boardwalk post-Sandy, but also represents the ongoing work of the city in constructing itself. Next. Another kind of industry of the city is our waste system. And this is a sanitation garage. Again, I'm just pulling things from our portfolio. Again, these are workplaces in the city, and the moving around of kind of how we deal with waste is in fact the work of New York City. And if you click through the next couple, sort of describing that. And then many architects and all of us, the fabric of the city of working in retail. This is a store that literally opened a week before the COVID, the March shutdown. You know, a sneaker and design company in Soho. Next. Another, now we're in the COVID era, an office space we worked on that opened during COVID that retrofitted all of its mechanical systems. But interestingly enough, because it's a hybrid of like production and has relatively low price points, it has continued to attract tenants, but kind of outskirts of New York City. Next. So now we are starting to look at education workplaces. This is in Dumbo. It's an installation for a charter school about how their teachers and students will get back to school and how they're lining up. So another kind of workplace issue. Next. We had a project that, you know, again, we think about music and entertainment, huge work, kind of focuses of work in New York City, including recording and other things. This is Bronx Music Hall, a project long in planning in the Bronx, but the musicians have been actually staging concerts in front of the construction site during COVID to, again, connect to their audiences when eventually the construction will finish. Again, slow down because of COVID. Next image. I'm moving us through the COVID timeframe. Also under construction, and I'm going to end with 2 slides. 2 maybe thinking about, you know, again, for me, the focus is on making in the city, and the city is a producer, not just a consumer. And so this is the peninsula in Hunts Point, perhaps under construction, EDC, New York City's Economic Development Corporation, along with Mutual Housing of New York, is putting a food production manufacturing building for 100% affordable housing in Hunts Point, which, as many of you know, is home to the fish market and to New York City's produce market. Last slide, and this is sort of hats off to David Ehrenberg of the Navy Yard, is once all those buildings are really adaptively reused for all sorts of, what is the next era? This is looking from Farragut houses, an idea of a phase in the Navy Yard's master plan being connected completely to education and to the opportunity to see education and production and manufacturing as part of one ecosystem. And there we are, pre and post COVID in 4 minutes or less.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. I'm really struck, and I'm delighted that all of the slides you showed were of workplaces that really by definition can't simply be exported someplace else, because they are about the functioning of the city of New York. And as long as there are people, we are going to need places to be educated and to educate students. We're going to need food production. We're going to need manufacturing to serve a lot of the industries here. We're going to need cultural production. These are all things that help us get away from the sort of one-sided conversation, which is important but limited, of are people going to go back to the office or just going to keep working from home? These are all examples of workplaces that really bypass that question. So we'll talk more about that. And David, I want to go on to you and tell us a little bit more about what is happening, what will happen, what may perhaps no longer be happening at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and how that's dealing with this whole era.
Yeah, so the Brooklyn Navy Yard, many of the listeners probably know, but we are a former naval shipyard, the federal government, that the city of New York purchased in the 1960s when the federal government closed the facility down. It's now managed by us. We are a not-for-profit real estate developer, not-for-profit before, frankly, before being a real estate developer. And our mission and focus is on creating high-quality middle-class jobs in the modern manufacturing and industrial sector. We do that by providing real estate and real estate at prices and other terms that manufacturers can afford, and that may not necessarily be market, but that allow these critical pieces of public infrastructure or infrastructure to exist in New York. And most importantly for us, these companies create high quality, middle class accessible jobs. A little bit about the Navy Yard, just demographically, we're big, we're 300 acres. That is about half the size of Prospect Park, about a third of the size of Central Park. We have about 6 million square feet of real estate under roof that we manage or that private partners manage with us. And 7 years ago or so, we had 6,000 people working at the Navy Yard. In about 6 months before COVID, we had 10,000. 3 months before COVID, we had 11,000. The month before COVID, we hit 12,000. And we were on our way to 20,000 people working in the Navy Yard in the next year or two. COVID's obviously slowed that down quite dramatically, but we still see extraordinary strength and demand for the kind of space that we provide. The other part of our mission, though, is to help the local community, and particularly those with historic barriers to employment, to access the jobs at the Navy Yard. And in addition to just placing people into jobs, we are leaning very heavily into helping develop the skills that are necessary for the next generation of jobs. Because while we are still focused on manufacturing, and the Navy Yard's been focused on manufacturing for 200 years, the nature of manufacturing is changing. And there's really nothing that the Navy Yard can do about that. There's nothing that the city of New York can do about that. The skills that are required are increasing. And we work very hard to keep our longstanding old line manufacturers in place. But the reality is that all companies have to evolve, and the skills are evolving as well. And so we've launched a number of programs over the last couple of years to really focus really heavily on those skills requirements. We designed a new type of career and technical education high school that we pitched to the city of New York. That school opened 2 years ago as a partnership with the Department of Education, and we are now pretty actively developing the model so that it can be exported to other areas of New York City and the region and country. And then lastly, we a couple of years ago, looked at ourselves and said that as part of our mission really focuses on diversity and in the workforce and making sure that there are jobs for all New Yorkers. We kind of had one of those moments where we asked ourselves, is that the full focus that we should have? And we said, no, we also need to be thinking about the entrepreneurial opportunities at the Yard, and how do we make those, the entrepreneurs, the company owners, as representative of the city of New York as possible. And we did our homework and we looked at our numbers, and we were honest with ourselves that our tenant base was not as diverse as we would want. The workforce was, but the tenant base was not. And so we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years around that. Most recently, last month, we released a RFP for we're calling an equity incubator. So an incubator focused primarily on supporting entrepreneurs of color, and particularly Black entrepreneurs. It was a very wide open RFEI to ask the community of social entrepreneurs what they thought this population of companies needed. We have our opinions, but we didn't want to be overly prescriptive. But we are we'll be getting responses back in January, and we'll be leaning really heavily into that as well, again, to make sure that the entrepreneurial opportunities at the Yard are just as accessible and as the jobs.
Thank you, David. The subtitle for this talk is Building a More Equitable New York. And as you can tell, we've assembled some people who think of job creation and entrepreneurship in social equity terms. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means when it comes to making concrete decisions and prioritizing. But that's a good lead into Esmeralda Herrera, who is, as I said, based in the South Bronx, and is developing a place that's really similar to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in its mission at a very different scale. But it's about bringing people together in one place to serve as kind of an entrepreneurship beacon for the neighborhood and really for the city as a whole. So, Esmeralda, tell us more.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Justin, and the Museum of the City of New York for having me. So, as Director of Programs and Community Relations at Communitas America, we're a nonprofit whose mission is to develop impact ecosystems together with diverse change makers and under-resourced communities. We're tackling inequalities and economic justice, education, and health and well-being to enable that upward mobility. I'd like to share a little bit about the community narrative. The Bronx has the lowest salary in New York City, sitting at just $38,000 a year. And with COVID heightening unemployment across the nation, the Bronx sits at an 18% unemployment, which is highest not just in the city or the state, but the nation. And so I'd like to share what we at Communitas America are doing to support the local economy in my home, the South Bronx. We can go to the next slide. So Hay Ground will serve as the headquarters for Communitas America, our social impact programming. This building is literally 1 minute walk from the 205 train. The building is currently under development and it has purposely been kept contextual with the neighborhood. It was built back in 1904 and the building has really served many purposes, but it was a former furniture warehouse, but it has been left unused for almost the last 10 years. So meet Hay Ground, more than just a building, but an innovation hub that envisions a more just and inclusive Bronx with opportunities for residents of the borough's diverse neighborhoods and communities. Hay Ground really cultivates an ecosystem for innovation, entrepreneurship, and community that will hopefully accelerate the Bronx social impact sector. We can go to the next slide. And as a community-based nonprofit, we are and have been working closely with the community. Many nonprofits like Dream Yards, the Third Avenue Bid, all through co-design sessions so that the building can serve the way the community envisions it. And they spoke. They requested a lively, place-based community where members know one another and build a consortium of partners and entrepreneurs that help realize each other's visions. Next slide. Communitas America has served social entrepreneurs for the last 2.5 years. This community is filled with 5 accelerator cohorts, 70 entrepreneurs, 72% from the Bronx, 75% Black African American, 66% women, all supported either through workshops, small seed grants, mentorship, and business planning. The next slide, please. We have built this community through our accelerator program, which supports overlooked and underestimated entrepreneurs who are hoping to make great social impact in their Bronx communities and the disparities that they have experienced, whose ventures we believe can ultimately impact other cities and communities battling similar issues. So you can go to the next slide. So Hay Ground is a 45,000 square feet of social innovation space located at 521 Bergen Avenue. That's on the 3rd Avenue corridor of the South Bronx. And the building has so much, right? Event space, some private offices, podcast room, etc. Next slide. So with the pandemic, we have this online community platform for Bronx-based community leaders and entrepreneurs. A low-cost membership to HayNet includes access to a directory of Bronx entrepreneurs, a range of resources, workshops, and networking opportunities that really help their social venture grow. Next slide. And so we're excited to be here to talk about the opportunity for a fair city and what needs to happen now for the health of the city and addressing inequalities. Our small slice in the South Bronx is cultivating that accessibility and affordability, a community designed with a collective creation and a collective desire. Next slide. So thank you. Looking forward to chatting more.
Great. Well, thank you. Claire, are you coming back? There you are. And don't forget to turn your microphone on. Everybody, turn your mics on. I'm hoping we can sort of make this as much of a cross-talk conversation as Zoom will allow. And for the audience, it's always sort of a little disturbing to be talking to people we know are out there, but we can't see or sense their presence except just in a number at the bottom of the screen. So help us out, ask questions in the Q&A. You can start whenever. I'll be seeing them and I will do my best to fold them into our conversation. But I want to ask all 3 of you and to address in however you want. And these are, everything you've shown are all projects, ideas, long-term efforts that long predate the pandemic. And what I found in reporting about the changes that the pandemic has brought is that I get a very similar response from a lot of people I talk to, which is the pandemic has changed everything. And what it's done most is prove that the way I was doing things was right all along. And so I don't need to change. We just need to double down on what we've been doing. So I want to ask all of you, I suspect I'll get a similar answer on many of the things because in fact, much of what you've been doing is even more important now than it was before. But have the last, what are we up to, 9 months, 10 months, have they really profoundly affected anything about the way you think about the future and about the way you think of what it is you do, about your mission, or about how you are going to go about carrying that out? And I open that to whomever wants to answer that first.
Who wants to go? Okay, I even though I'm looking at Esmeralda going, she has a mission. So, but you know, as a kind of private actor in New York, we don't have a mission the way that Communitas and Navy Yard does. But I would say we all have a mission in New York right now, in the sense of caring about the city and being a bit mystified about how each one of us can stay safe, but play an activist role in not letting this moment go to waste. I have to say that, you know, it continues to be shocking, but for me, the idea of outdoors, but also natural ventilation, but the people's awareness of the kinds of buildings, their spaces they're in, the kinds of streets they're on, has become acute. And so I would say in general that that's not what we were doing before, either in the planning or architecture community. There was an acceptance of a highly, you know, mechanized space, of assuming that that someone else is taking care of our air. And I think right now there is a certain kind of reality about, or trust, a level of trust, right? That I think has to play a significant role in how we really look at revitalizing the city, which means that the entrepreneurs who are able to really engage that directly, you know, whether it was the ventilators, the PPE that Navy Yard was able to do, well, what happens next? Or the kind of entrepreneurs in the Bronx who are having ideas about how to tell people what's really going on, how to do something about it. I think we are not going to go back to just looking at our physical environment and assuming it's okay.
So one of the things we've talked about in the past, Claire, just to stay with that for a minute, is retail as a form of work. And, you know, right now there is an incredible amount of retail space that is simply lying fallow or that is not working economically. To some extent that was true before the pandemic. We don't know to what extent that's going to be true afterwards, but clearly retail is going through a major shift, which means that all of our street fronts, the physical presence of retail on the street, and therefore the street life itself, is going to change with it. So tell me some of your thoughts as an architect about how we deal with all of that space and the street life that we want to activate it if retail is not the driver that it was.
It's very interesting. I was sort of thinking, as Esmeralda was talking about the Bronx, and I was thinking about Fordham Road and Fordham Plaza in contrast to Midtown and other places that now don't have the footfall to even warrant the kinds of retail footprint. So we could all say that that's going to, once there's a vaccine, we're all going to go back to shopping. That might or might not be true. I mean, people will still order in. At the same time, I think there's a reality about, I'll call it the 15 or 20 minute city, which is this idea that in fact, local and local retail is perhaps a different thing than just any kind of retail. And therefore, it should give those spaces that are retail the ability to kind of more directly deal with needs of a local neighborhood. And of course, that may change the real estate metric for retail space. But this, as a city, people have gone through many years of sometimes retail's worth a lot and the upper floors weren't. And then sometimes the upper floors were worth a lot and retail wasn't. So I do feel like what's great about vertical, which New York City is the ability to kind of redefine those spaces of what is used for one thing, one era, and used differently, a different era.
Yeah, that's a good point. I used to think of New York much more as a second floor city because a lot of the most interesting retail was upstairs. People providing services, up a little flight of stairs, and some business that, has no street front, but
Yep.
that you need to know. And a lot of that, of course, has disappeared. David, pick up on anything we've been talking about, but I particularly want to ask you, since you are now effectively the landlord or I'm not sure actually exactly what the relationship is, but you now actually have an office building in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a new one, and it was partially developed by WeWork, which, as we know, is kind of like the poster child for the pre-pandemic, Wild West of shared workspaces. And then the company kind of went through an earthquake of its own. And I visited not that long ago. It was very pleasantly deserted at the time. And of course, I'm really not going to ask anybody to prognosticate, unless you really want to, about whether people are going to come back to the office and what the future of that's going to be like. But I'm guessing that, this whole question of whether office spaces in the future of New York and therefore the Brooklyn Navy Yard must be weighing on you.
So that building actually is one of those public-private partnerships. So we did not develop it. We don't lease it. It was part of a vision of a fully vibrant industrial manufacturing ecosystem where we believe that modern manufacturers need and want to be close to other uses, including office uses. Industrial manufacturing zoning is obviously a hot button topic, and oftentimes, an MX designation is really just a transition away from manufacturing. We're in a different scenario because we're a nonprofit and we own all of the real estate around an investment like that. And so we can say we want some office and we're going to keep it manufacturing, and our mission ensures that that's true. And it's different than a zoning solution to that. So I can't really talk too much about the inner workings of that specific building. But the Navy Yard does have a mix of some office uses that we administer in our buildings. We tend to develop our buildings where our manufacturers pay well less than the cost of rehabilitating the building. And so we put some office space in those buildings in order to cross-subsidize the manufacturers so that we can keep it affordable for the manufacturers, in addition to using historic and new market tax credits and all the other tricks of the trade. So, it is something that we've been thinking about. I can just speak as an employer of 200 people, and we are starting to think about what our work from home policy will be after the pandemic, because clearly the team will ask and expect some more flexibility. But it could not be plainer to me that long-term working from home is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for our employees personally. I don't know of a single employee who is unabashed, kind of fully happier working from home. There are certainly elements of it that are positive, but the amount of resources that we're putting into mental health for our employees is many orders of magnitudes more than what it was before. And obviously the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor is part of that. But I think this social isolation of spending your days cooped up in a house is no small part of it. And then as an employer, we're doing amazing stuff, but the creativity and the collaboration and that stuff is just not possible on Zoom to get to recreate it. It's just, in my opinion, it's just not. And for companies who say it is, if I could short sell them on the stock market, I would, if I could maintain the short, because I think it's long-term unimaginable to me, honestly, that that's the case for any company. So, we're relatively confident. We're confident the Yard partially because we really think that there is a huge pent-up demand for the kind of space for modern manufacturers that the market is not and has not met. But I as a native New Yorker, am also just fundamentally confident that people will return back to the city. One of our tenants said to me something that actually kind of makes a lot of sense to me. It's like, the Roaring Twenties happened after 1918 for a reason. And
yeah.
Like, I don't know who is sitting at their home being like, gee, I don't want to go out and listen to music. Gee, I don't want to go out and go to a restaurant. Gee, I don't want to, that is exactly what we're all missing. Like, once we feel safe, which will happen hopefully relatively soon, that stuff will come back. Now, I think there's a very interesting, sorry, I'll cede the floor in a second. I think there's a very interesting policy question that we're pushing the city to really think about, which is, there are unfortunately, a lot of restaurants and bars and other venues that are closing, and that will create large entrepreneurial opportunities when the economy comes back. And unfortunately, we know who takes advantage of those opportunities. It's people who have, can turn to friends and family for startup money. And so making, the focus is rightfully on preserving the companies that we have, but I also think that there's going to be a moment where there's a reflourishing of entrepreneurialism, and making sure that that is equitable, I think, is the next phase for the city really to grapple with, and a very difficult one, but a really important one.
So how do you envision that working?
Put me on the spot. I think that there are a number of tools in the toolbox the city can use. I think a huge amount of it comes down to community development financial institutions. Those entities are under stress because their existing portfolios are not performing as any lender, but they're nonprofit lenders who specialize in lending to low income immigrant populations. And if they're off the field, it is an enormous problem, and they don't have the balance sheets to snap to. And I would say the federal government has been dramatically unhelpful on this. The PPP program, which was a disaster in the first phase, was in no small part a disaster because the Fed opened a window to allow banks to access liquidity to write PPP loans, and they excluded CDFIs from that window, which is just extraordinary, just an extraordinary statement of values. And so you saw PPPs going to larger companies because that's who Chase Manhattan cares about. And the CDFIs were literally excluded with intent from that program.
Yeah. Just to stay with the sort of change in the workplace and entrepreneurship, it strikes me, as a writer, I'm used to working from home. I've been doing it my whole life, and I like it. And I only was really ever able to go into the office and meet people when I wasn't too busy, because, when I really need to get stuff done, I need to do it from home. And I've been impressed in the last 9 months at how seamlessly New York Magazine, even the print side, was able to transition to a decentralized model where, we're just doing the same thing, except we can't, our editors can't gather around a big board with photographs on them or lay out big layout mock-ups on a filing cabinet, but somehow we managed to get it done. But at the same time, I recognize that, in this and in so many ways, we are subsisting on the resources that we built up before the pandemic started. And that has to do with, friendship. It's hard to make new ones. So we're, leaning on the relationships we made before. It has to do with work habits. And I can't imagine, I think nothing must be harder than starting a new job in the middle of this pandemic, except, of course, losing one. But so I think a lot of what we've been talking about brings me back to this, to Esmeralda, and this question of like, how important is it to have a space, to have an actual place where the people you're in contact with can come together? And you mentioned, and I want to come back to this, or it relates to something that Claire said, the proximity to the subway station is really important because no building is an island. It all depends on how you get there and what's right outside your door. But talk to us a little bit more about like what it's going to mean for people to eventually be able to come into the building once the construction is done and it's safe, and really sort of meet each other face to face.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all saying something similar, that people want community, right? And they want to find a space where they can connect with others, be that on a personal level, right? If they're going to a bar, or on a professional level, as entrepreneurs, and a lot of our entrepreneurs have talked about like, how am I meeting people now? How am I networking? How am I establishing partnerships that could lead me to the next thing? So for example, for our entrepreneurs, when we used to hold entrepreneur roundtables, which, yes, you can do that digitally, but it doesn't feel the same. And sometimes it doesn't produce the same results that you desire. And a lot of them, when we had these entrepreneur roundtables, will then create these partnerships where they could pitch together because they're battling these inequalities. They're saying, okay, well, we as five, for example, we as 5 Black women with separate missions, how are we going to lift each other's voices up? We'll pitch, we'll divide, we'll conquer. But going back to, so yes, community is so important. And I think that's something people value a lot. And we see that even with the conversations now, right? So for Hay Ground, our development is still in construction. And we were very strategic of making sure that we ask people, not just partners, not just entrepreneurs, but literally public people, just random people, to come and do a co-design session so that they can share their opinion of what a building could mean for them. So this area that I talked about, 1 minute walk from the subway, is literally not just next to the subway, but it's the highest walking traffic in the South Bronx. And what that facility could mean for people to see, oh, this is an entrepreneurship. I can enter this type of field, right? I see other people who look like me in this area, means a lot, because in the Bronx, a lot of jobs that people have are still, it may not be an entrepreneur job, it may not be this quote unquote white collar job. So I think building out a space is still so important. And I think we see that for us, even now, as the entrepreneurs ask for it. Oh, I can't wait for it to come. I'm excited. And I think the last thing I'll add to that is the co-creation is important, because as we co-create, we think about, well, if the Bronx has 18% unemployment, then how do we make this financially accessible? And we have looked at our strategy over and over again so that it could be literally well below market rate, and folks can find accessibility, not just in the parameter of physical, but in being in the office there itself.
So I haven't been, right around there, obviously, and I'm a year, I guess. What does the retail look like right outside your door now, or right outside the door of the forthcoming facility in that block?
Yeah, it's actually kind of exciting, and I like it, but there are things that even our entrepreneurs are addressing. So right outside the block, you'll have a plaza, which is super big, and people are just lounging around in that plaza. people are walking up and down this area because there'll be like a furniture store right there for them to buy a 99-cent store right there. There'll be like maybe a Wendy's, right? Across the street from us is a VIM, so streetwear. People are still poking their heads inside because they're looking for a sense of community. They're looking for a sense of belonging, and seeing other people in this pandemic says, hey, I see you, we see you, we have a mask on, right? And we're going through this pandemic together as these Bronxites. So, and then there's so much, there's a lot of sneaker stores, a lot of street vendors there selling either jewelry, you know, the gold hoops, or selling churros, right? And it's still a lively place that people are going to be passing by. Now, thinking about that, though, are some of the very issues that our entrepreneurs are tackling. So thinking about that there might just be 99-cent pizza around, or there might be, you know, a restaurant that serves Dominican food. Our entrepreneurs are thinking, okay, how do we get more food accessibility that's healthier in our neighborhood?
Yeah. It's always so interesting to me, the minute you start to take apart any issue, you know, how do we use this space? How do we connect that? In New York, everything is so interlaced that you really can't talk about, you know, where people go to work without also looking to how they get there, what they see outside, what street traffic is like, what the retail is like, where they shop on their way home, what home they're going to, and all these things are so interconnected. I see on the question and answer that Sandra, who's actually my upstairs neighbor, has a question right about this. And actually what I was getting to before, Claire, because you and I talked about this some time ago, was, can you give us some specific ideas about as the retail spaces on the street front change function, as their value changes, as street traffic drops and falls, what are some ways we can think about being flexible about how to adapt them? And I think this plays into another unstated thing we've been talking about, which is adapting existing spaces, right? Almost all the things that we've been talking about are taking existing buildings and reworking them for the purposes we have now. So tell us a little bit more, as an architect and somebody who kind of envisions the fabric of the city, what are we going to do, you know, when a big business that's got 10, 15,000 square feet at storefront, or a small mom and pop store that's only got 1,500 square feet goes out of business, and the landlord, you know, is tempted just for tax reasons just to leave it empty, but we don't want that to happen. What happens there?
Well, I think it ties right into what David was talking about, which is the financial tools we have. I think we have to imagine that. I just noticed today that California has a huge small business program that people can basically get rent abatements from and business help. So imagine if all the big banks, if their loans to landlords, or if their deferments of mortgages related to extremely lowering the cost of retail spaces, you would have the opportunities for entrepreneurs to think about those spaces differently, right? A lot of retail space, people who took very small spaces, I think about the Fulton Mall, right? Because that's all that you could afford, but you had enough footfall. So if you have neighborhoods with still a lot of people with buying power at different levels, an entrepreneur in the Bronx, an entrepreneur even in Midtown near subways could take more risks if the cost per square footage for a certain level of time, the short-term leases, then I think you would see someone making, you know, literally bakeries being able to move in while they had and teaching baking. You know, right now that takes a lot. And I was thinking even of Harlem Brewing Company. Why wouldn't you be teaching beer brewing, right, and techniques, or even having a code class? Or why wouldn't you reinterpret lobbies in buildings, do things? I think what's keeping people is the paradigm of how expensive ground floors are. But if, again, there was incentives from lenders, especially on existing mortgages, to do something about that, I do believe you could incentivize ultimately more income because you get more entrepreneurial activity. And I do think that, again, storefronts, would they get converted to garage doors so that you could access more of the interior space? There's been great examples of all sorts of interesting things that people could do with buildings, especially buildings that you can cut through to other streets. All of a sudden, you could do more things with that. Right now, our focus has been on big box in the city. So you get these big, dark, deep spaces that are blocks of space. Once those open up, we could, I always look at Paris and arcades and stuff, but our city could be much more of an indoor-outdoor city if some of those big box spaces were in fact incentivized to be pass-throughs to access more spaces.
So what do you guys think of right now? There's a probably healthy push to try to bring some retail out onto the street so that we limit the number of people going into enclosed spaces. But there's always kind of a danger of unintended consequences there, right? If you start to undercut the businesses that are paying rent, that are doing, traditional stores and traditional storefronts, and they've made investments in their property, and they want to be able to keep a certain kind of inventory and prices and traffic. If you start to undercut all that with street vendors or even the same businesses kind of expanding onto the sidewalk, that may have some unintended consequences. How should we be thinking about the connection between street front workspaces, whether they're retail or doctor's offices or city MD or whatever they are, and the public space outside?
Well, I did want to add one more thing, and I know I'm using up too much time, is that we used to live in a city of, in fact, street vendors, and in fact, they were so popular that we made, under, I can't remember which mayor, Beam, right? They actually made Essex Market and all these market halls in order to not compete with stores or even block stores. So I think it is time to think about our streets as not just giving up sidewalk, but giving up road width, certain road width, to in fact create market streets again. Why not have a department of markets in the city and actually look at open street system, and that wouldn't compete directly with retail because it could be much more temporal and seasonal. And maybe then retail could be able to do other things that outdoor markets can't do.
I just want to remind the audience, if you're just joining us, that we have a Q&A channel open, and you're welcome to ask questions there at any time. I can see those. I'll try to work those into the conversation. You can direct them to individual members of the panel or to all of us as you like. So much of what we try to, what looks like a good idea, it winds up being so constrained by these layered regulations. And you try to open a small business and you've got so many inspectors and agencies to deal with that you wind up not only spending money on the fees, but then you have to hire facilitators and lawyers to, just to get the doors open. And that is obviously a disincentive above and beyond the rent. And then, and David, maybe you want to jump in on this, there's the whole question of zoning, right? Because so much of what we're talking about is flexibility. You want to open a little manufacturing storefront entrepreneurial activity, fine. Is it zoned for manufacturing? Well, you better find out. Do you want to, have build an apartment building or renovate one in which, some people want to be able to just like walk downstairs to work, and maybe they're making something in a sort of open space, or if you're adapting an office building to a kind of mixed use. When we think of mixed use projects, they tend to be of a certain kind of formality, and often, on the largest scale, you wind up with something like Hudson Yards, where you have discrete buildings, a shopping mall, an office building, a residential building, just simply close together. And that's what we call a mixed use building. Can any of you address a little bit how we get to more of the kind of promiscuous mixture of activities that I think we all sort of have in our imaginations, but that is really hard to realize in New York?
So I'm not sure my answer is really a to-scale answer, but I do think that it is a big part of it. I mean, we do a lot of thinking about this, and the challenge with manufacturing zoning is that in the 60s, when the manufacturing zoning text was written, manufacturing was the use apart. And it was intentionally kept away from other uses because it was noxious. And that's not manufacturing. That's not the vast majority of manufacturing anymore. The vast majority of manufacturing is not that. And to some extent, now with the encroachment of other uses in manufacturing districts, there's a pushback of wanting to protect manufacturing from those other uses. So it's again a use apart, but for the opposite reason. And neither of those, I mean, we think of ourselves as the,
Sorry for interrupting. Just to clarify, do you mean that because, say, residential real estate is a better value proposition, that the push is to encroach on manufacturing districts?
Right, and then local communities, elected officials fight that and want to preserve the manufacturing zoning as is. And we're major manufacturing advocates in the city, so we see the value of preserving manufacturing. But the problem is that it's freezing manufacturing in time, where we truly believe that manufacturing companies need to and want to be connected to the city, and they don't want to necessarily be in advocates of IBZs. We're an IBZ, but in an IBZ cut off from all other uses, where with limited services and the like, and particularly for modern manufacturers, which are part manufacturing, part design, part technology companies, that's a particularly hard mix. A lot of our tenants, they would not set up shop in an IBZ, or most IBZs, honestly, because the company founder is a PhD roboticist who wants their $5 latte. And that's, not like, it's maybe elitist or whatever, but it is just the reality. And so that there's been a real kind of inversion, but resulting in the same thing, which keeps manufacturing away from the lifeblood of the city, which we think is really a problem. Zoning is a blunt tool. It's a blunt tool the day you write it, and 10 years later, it's pretty wrong. And we've got the same zoning we had 60 years ago, and it's totally wrong for us now. And so what we're really advocating is nonprofit ownership of some of these assets. And like with Community Justice Americas, I mean, that sounds like a fantastic project. And I think the city can help subsidize and support more not-for-profits taking on projects like that. And we've been advocates for that, because that mixing, it has to be curated, or else it becomes its own kind of monoculture. And I think it's very hard to ask the private market to do that curation with social equity and value in mind. And zoning is not the right answer either. And so having a cadre of nonprofit developers who can do that, I think it could be extraordinarily powerful. And we look to the affordable housing community as a corollary. And 40 years ago, whatever it was, 50 years ago, that community was in no small part created by the city by putting large amounts of public money on the table. And a community of developers was created. My wife was the former ED of the Furman Center, so there are think tanks for affordable housing. And there's no particular reason why that couldn't happen in commercial. And we think that it really should. And it sounds like what Esmeralda is doing is part of that. And more of it should happen.
We have, there's been a packed discussion, and we've reached the end of our time. Before we actually sign off, what I'd like to do is ask you to imagine that we can figure out who among the 12, 25, 30 candidates for mayor, they keep popping up and new ones every day, will in fact get the job. And you have a couple minutes to sit down with that person and tell them what you need from that administration, stipulating that the first answer that any mayor is going to give you is, look, I know you're coming for subsidies. We have a massive fiscal hole, and we're in no position to start funneling money into whatever it is your particular thing is right now. Is there anything that, from your point of view, the next mayor could do that would really move the needle, make the city a little bit more equitable in the specific ways that you're all trying to do it? Maybe Esmeralda, if you want to lead this off. I mean, if you had a couple of minutes with the mayor, what do you say?
Oh boy, Justin, what a hard question. But
it is.
I think that question, some things came up for me, and some of them I think speak to what I've seen our social entrepreneurs try to answer. Social inequalities. I think about, okay, let's say the mayor's like, look, I don't got no more funding for you. I will ask, like, well, then let's not convert, community gardens into to sell them, right? Let's keep them keep them in the Bronx. Let's keep them open for people to be able to utilize for healthy disperse of vegetables, so that entrepreneurs can cultivate programs that then again feed the neighborhood, right? I think that's the immediate one. But I also think about, let's not create these silos. And I think that speaks to the previous question that, Justin, you were talking about, like, what are these unintended consequences? I love my Bronx, but I want it to also flourish. So how do we allow those who are leaders of that community lead, but be celebrated by all? And so I think I would think about, like, hey, how do we highlight some of the work that the Bronx is doing so that folks may want to visit and may want to check out and celebrate with community leaders and those entrepreneurs who are fronting the lead, so that folks can then realize, yes, this is a place to invest in. Yes, this is a place so social capital can be invested in Black and Latino entrepreneurs who are creating solutions that do not just solve Bronx issues, but that solve a lot of issues across the nation. So I think that's what I would ask of him.
All right. Thank you for that. Claire?
I was waiting for David to
all right. We'll punt it to David then.
Well, so trying to be conscious of the fiscal constraint that you assigned. This may be a little bit off topic, but I think I mentioned that we created this new model of career and technical education in the city, which really had as its core a realization that if you bring students and teachers in closer proximity to industry, that good things can happen. That the feedback loop on the skills that are needed for the modern economy can be sped up from what's happening now, which is unfortunately years and sometimes decades to much faster. But that there's also a real educational value in challenging high school students to walk into a place of work and to walk into an adult environment. One of the members of the Board of Regents, Dr. Lester Young, was one of our thought partners in developing the concept of the high school. And he said something in our first meeting about this that became a mantra for me in designing the school, which was, you put a high school student in a school and they act like a kid, and you put them in a place of work and they act like the young adults that they are. Mm-hmm. And that then has spillover effects into our catchphrase at the high school is agency, that we're trying to build agency among the students, and putting them in an adult environment is a big part of that. What adult wants to sit behind a desk and read a book that somebody else tells them to read? We don't. Why would you think a 16-year-old would, right? Going through all the changes that they're going through, what they want is agency. What they want is some level of control over their lives, and the adults in their lives all too often respond to that by saying, no, sit here and read that, instead of saying, oh, you're interested in podcasting? Cool, write a script for a podcast. Why is that worse than writing a script about the King of England that I had to write a book report about and don't remember at all and never would have? So I think that connection between education and industry and the skills required to excel in the modern economy is something that really just largely requires dialogue. I think that's partially at a high school level. And then, last thing, if you're talking about equity and you're talking about the middle class, in my opinion, everybody who's in this field needs to take a deep breath, look in the mirror and say, you know what, all roads lead through CUNY. And without fixing CUNY, and so.
All right. It is interesting to hear you say that, because, of course, for some people, the experience of going from school to work is going from an environment in which they are asked to think for themselves to an environment in which they were sat down at a desk and told to read something they don't necessarily want to read. But I understand if you work that in earlier and it's part of the education system, you get a potentially different result. Claire, you get the last word, and then we will wrap it up.
2 words: environmental justice.
Yes, thank you.
I would like to say that the next mayor has to actually do her job that way, which is, we cannot ship our garbage out of New York and pay that kind of money when that kind of money could be going to schools and entrepreneurs in every borough. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars the city pays, and when in fact they could be actually recycling waste, composting. So we have to focus on being the most amazing environmental city. We have to focus on that in education. We have to give younger people in high schools jobs, green jobs, and the challenges, because I think that if we said as a city, forget it, we're not doing this starting, 2022, people would come up with solutions. And so it's that issue of the leadership in the city being able to say, in have neighborhoods, Upper West Side, Upper East Side, there's no more free parking anymore. We're all paying. In those neighborhoods, unless you're proving that you're on an assisted income, you are paying for your garbage. If we can be tough with ourselves, we can accept our privilege and say, we have to do our fair share. The ideas are going to be unbelievable. And education is the most important thing. But I do think paying our fair share, people in the city who are not paying their fair share now, we have to do it.
Thank you all very much. This, for me, coming together with a group of people who are so obviously passionate, not just about New York, but about making it a better place, is always an exciting thing to do. Talking to you is invigorating, gives me hope, and it's been a great conversation. In an hour, just to touch on a couple of things, we have talked about food production and zoning and manufacturing and entrepreneurship and paying for garbage disposal and parking. And I left out probably 25 other topics, each of which could potentially be a panel discussion of its own. However, we're gonna leave it there. I encourage everybody to join us again on January 27th for part 3 of this series, where we're going to be focusing on some of the things we talked about today, namely In Between, which is largely going to be about public space and transportation. And we can revisit some of those questions of what happens as society and work and home changes. And those things all change. What happens to the space that we all share? And how do we use it differently in the next era of New York City? So thank you all very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.